everyone, welcome to your Learn Lab. My name is Seema, and if you are an IGNOU student, you're at the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit that subscribe button to join me on this learning journey. In today's video on William Butler Yeats, a poet whose intellectual and spiritual journey maps the transformation of modern poetry itself, I will walk you through Yeats' early poetic career, which is briefly. This has been covered in detail in another video. I have also added a card for it, so do make sure you go check that out. We will go on to address the historical and intellectual background, followed by the poetic career until 1910, after which there is a drastic shift in his style. And towards the end, we have two poems for close reading, Adam's Curse and No Second Troy. Let's first take a brief look at Yeats' background. W.B. Yeats won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923. He was obviously an internationally recognized poet, and especially for his powerful and visionary poetry. If you see his career, it spans two major literary movements. First, he began with dreamlike beauty of the pre-modern romanticism and then transitioned into the sharper, more reflective tones of modernism. He was a master of both styles, and he did it with equal brilliance. Another aspect of Yeats is that he was a lifelong seeker of the mystical. He was deeply drawn into magic, the occult, and Celtic mythology. These are the influences which helped him challenge the scientific as well as the mechanistic view of the universe that defined his age. Instead, he foregrounded symbols, myths, and spiritual ideas as alternate ways of understanding human existence. As time passed, the real world, its violence, politics, and disorder, entered his poetry. What Yeats did was he wanted to create a philosophical system to bring structure to the chaos of the modern life. One of the defining features of his poetry is a deep dialectic, which is a constant tension between the material and the spiritual, between flesh and spirit. He begins his poetic journey with an escape into an idealized fairyland, but over time he searches for a different kind of escape, into a world of pure, eternal ideas. Let's take a look at his early life. We can see that W.B. Yeats' poetic sensibility was shaped from the very beginning by very opposing familial influences. If you look at his father, John Butler Yeats, he was a painter who introduced him to the world of English intellectualism through the London Circle. But from his mother's Pollock's family in Sligo, he got a very different model that involved instinct, physicality, and a sort of earthbound wisdom. This duality laid the foundation for Yeats' lifelong tendency to think in terms of polarities and dialectical oppositions between self and anti-self, dark and full moon, or the widening and narrowing gyres that later formed his symbolic system. He articulated this internal conflict beautifully in Per Amica Silentia Lunae, where he says, "When we quarrel with others, we produce rhetoric, but when we quarrel with ourselves, we produce poetry." The clash between the Anglo-Irish identity and Celtic heritage was not merely personal. It was intellectual and spiritual. Reinforced by his readings of Blake, Swedenborg, and Neoplatonism, Yeats crafted a worldview that sought to resolve the existential antinomy of flesh and spirit through what he called passionate wisdom. Let's dive a little deeper into the influence of identity on poetry. We can see that much of Yeats' poetry finds its roots in the Sligo landscape, a region teeming with myth and memory. This landscape, especially the majestic Ben Bulben, became not only a poetic symbol but also Yeats' chosen burial site, signifying his deep spiritual attachment. Poems like The Lake Isle of Innisfree and The Stolen Child express a longing for this mythic refuge where Celtic folklore could offer escape from modern industrial life. After Crossways and especially with the wanderings of Oisin, which is in 1889, Yeats made a conscious choice, as he later explained in Ireland and the Arts, to abandon Arcadian or Indian exoticism and to root his poetic scenery exclusively in Ireland. This was part of his broader mission to recover a distinctively Irish identity, even if it meant drawing on antiquarian and sometimes sentimental elements of Celtic legend. Yet, this recovery wasn't simple. As an Anglo-Irish Protestant, he belonged to the very ascendancy class that Irish nationalism sought to overthrow. This class, which was torn between loyalty to England and the spiritual longing for Ireland, was virtually obliterated by the 1916 Easter Rebellion and Civil War. Yeats' dissatisfaction with institutional religion, particularly the dogmatic rationalism of Protestant orthodoxy, further distanced him from both English as well as Christian orthodoxy. Instead, he turned to pre-Christian Fenian traditions. His goal, as he puts it in autobiographies, was to create a modern myth. Not a Prometheus in Caucasus, but Patrick or Oisin at Cropatrick or Belbulben. In this sense, Yeats resembles T.S. Eliot in seeking cultural and spiritual depth in this enchanted world. But while Eliot turned to Christian orthodoxy, Yeats ventured into the heterodox and the occult. For W.B. Yeats, the mystical life became second only to poetry. Where Eliot found order in Christian tradition, Yeats turned instead to magic and mythology as the frameworks that could organize a fragmented world. He believed that all races, in their earliest cultural unity, had been bound by mythology, married to rock and hill, as he writes in autobiographies. This pursuit of unity, spiritual and poetic, led him to adopt the idea of anima mundi, or a collective unconscious, a reservoir of archetypes and images inherited across generations. Yeats' engagement with the occult was early and profound. Influenced by his astrologer uncle, George Pollux Fenn, he was already chairing meetings of the Dublin Hermetic Society in 1885. By 1890, he joined both the Theosophical Society of Madame Blavatsky and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded by MacGregor Mathers. It is from Blavatsky's concept of periodicity that Yeats likely drew his cyclical vision of history, where each epoch ends with a divine incarnation, a structure echoed in his work, The Secret Rose, and later in a vision. But Yeats wasn't just immersed in esotericism. He was deeply rooted in literary activity. And it is here that his mystical ideas merged with symbolic language and a distinctively Irish voice. While exploring magic, Yeats also played a vital role in the literary revival of his time. A founder of the Rhymers Club and the Irish Literary Societies of London and Dublin, he moved in circles that valued aesthetic complexity and spiritual interiority. As Richard Ellman notes in Yeats, The Man and the Mask, Yeats' doctrine of the mask owes much of the decadent idea that the artistic self is always a dual self, a self and the anti-self. This is what led him to collect Irish folktales, not merely as a nostalgic exercise, but as deep cultural memory. Fairy and folk tales, the Celtic Twilight, and representative Irish tales represent a turn to spiritual resources of the Irish Catholic peasantry filtered through his own mystical and symbolist lens. Like Lady Gregory, Yeats hoped to rediscover unity of man and nature, lost to enlightenment, reason, and scientific abstraction. The French symbolists, especially Mallarmé and Maeterlinck, further sharpened Yeats' vision. His 1894 visit to Paris and exposure to Axel by Villiers the Isle Adam and his friendship with Arthur Symons deepened his belief in the power of language to evoke invisible realities. In his early collections like The Rose, 1893, and The Wind Among the Reeds, 1899, Yeats used natural symbols, stars, words, waves, and most of all, the rose, to construct a mystical language of love, transience, and spiritual longing. Even when his verse is drenched in dreaminess, a controlled intellectual rhythm lends its strength. Yet, Yeats' dream world could not last untouched. The modern world, political violence, and personal disillusionment brought him much closer toward a new poetic idiom, one less burdened by reverie and most engaged with reality. So, let's see how Yeats moved into the 20th century. So, first of all, you'll see that his poetic voice began to shed its earlier dreamlike quality. Many events forced him to engage more directly with the world itself. One of the most transformative was his infatuation with Maud Gonne. He met her in 1889 and she was a charismatic Irish nationalist who inspired many of his early poems, but always remained emotionally distant. Her persistent refusal to marry him created a deep emotional fracture which ironically proved creatively fruitful. This love, unfulfilled and tragic, pulled Yeats into the orbit of nationalist politics, though his attitude remained ambivalent. He never fully shared Gonne's revolutionary fervor, but her presence pulled him closer to Ireland's turbulent public life. This engagement deepened over time, and Yeats eventually became a senator in the Irish Free State between 1922 and 1928, and that's when he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923. Interestingly, Maud Gonne eventually ceased to be an idealized symbol. In poems written after 1910, such as those in The Green Helmet, she appears as flesh and blood, flawed, impassioned, and politically tragic. Her image became a way for Yeats to connect personal anarchy with global disintegration, particularly during the Irish Civil War and World War I. But if you really look at it, it wasn't just romantic or political experiences that transformed Yeats. His work in theatre and new artistic influences also sharpened his poetic technique and helped him move away from the mystical reverie. Let's move on to another key influence in Yeats' stylistic transformation. That's his collaboration with Lady Gregory and Synge. This began in 1896. He started spending summers at Lady Gregory's estate, Coole Park, a place that would become both a literal and symbolic home for his creative evolution. Their joint efforts led to the creation of the Abbey Theatre, where Yeats took on a practical role, managing actors, writing scripts, and navigating the world of performance. This shift into theatre business, as he called it, was more than administrative. It taught Yeats to write with clarity and directness, to listen to the rhymes of spoken Irish, and to move away from the ornate diction of his earlier work. The dramatic medium also helped him embrace dialogue and conflict, tools that grounded his poetry more firmly in reality. One of the most significant artistic influences in this phase was Ezra Pound, who worked as Yeats' secretary from 1913 to 1916. Pound introduced Yeats to the stylized ritualistic world of Japanese no drama, which had anti-naturalistic and symbolic form. This had a very profound impact on Yeats' poetic diction and led to works like At the Hawk's Well in 1916, which blends symbolic myth with spare, chiseled language. So, from symbolic reverie to political and theatrical realism, Yeats' evolution was as much philosophical as it was poetic. Up next, we will explore Yeats' Ireland. So, if Maud Gonne represented revolutionary passion and tragic musehood, As we said, Lady Gregory became for Yeats a figure of stability, support, and aristocratic dignity. Her cool park estate actually offered him not just physical space to write, but also a model of nobility rooted in cultural heritage. In contrast to England, or even Ireland of Synge and O'Casey, early 20th century Ireland was rural, under-industrialized, and lacking a solid middle class. For Yeats, the nation was shaped by the tension between two groups, the Protestant landlords and the Catholic peasantry. Yeats' poetic consciousness became haunted by ancestral houses like Coole Park, many of which were burned or abandoned during the Civil War. His response was not political nostalgia, but a cultural one for the symbolic relationship between the noble and the commoner, the dreamer and the laborer. While Protestant nationalism did reject myth and legend, Catholic peasant tradition preserved them, which gave Yeats a bridge between aristocracy memory and popular ritual. This view of Ireland wasn't simply sentimental. Yeats used it as a vantage point to critique modern capitalist democratic values and reassert the poet's role in restoring spiritual and cultural unity. As time went by, Yeats' distrust of the emerging capitalist middle class is very clear in his prose as well as poetry. The metaphor of the horseman at Galway races recalls a time when poetry and myth were central to cultural life. Before, as he says, the merchant and the clerk breathed on the world with timid breath. In September 1913, Yeats bitterly laments the pious, penny-counting middle class, whose acquisitive religiosity has dried the marrow from the cultural bone. Yet, it was for this spiritually hollow world that Irish revolutionaries, the wild geese, gave their lives. In this paradox, Yeats sees the need for the poet as cultural visionary, echoing Shelley's idea of the poet as an unacknowledged legislator. For Yeats, Ireland was never just a political project, but a mythic one, a realm where buried spiritual identity had to be unearthed. In one of his final poems, The Statues, he imagines the revolutionary leader, Patrick Pearse, summoning Cuchulainn, the mythic warrior hero. "We Irish born into that ancient sect, but throw upon this filthy modern tide, and by its fauntless spawning fury wrecked, climb to our proper dog that we may trace the lineaments of a plummet measured face." So, out of the chaos of modern violence arises the plummet measured face, a symbol of unity of being, harmony, and spiritual proportion. In this vision, the heroic past is not dead, but waiting to be reawakened. So, as Yeats imagined Ireland's past and future through myth, he also developed an intricate system of personal and historical symbolism, the mask, the moon, and the gyres, which we will explore in this next section. W.B. Yeats' symbolic system, elaborated in a Vision, 1925, revised in 1937, was born not just from mysticism but also from marriage and the automatic writing sessions he conducted with his wife, George Hyde Lees. Through these writings, he developed a triad of symbols, the mask, the moon, and the gyre, each representing a way to impose structure on the flux of identity and history. The mask, as first outlined in Per Amica Silentia Lunae, represents the anti-self, the persona one must consciously adopt to discipline and transcend the mundane self. Yeats writes, "Active virtue is therefore theatrical, consciously dramatic, the wearing of a mask." This idea owes much of his experience in theatre, especially the mass drama of Japanese No and classical Greek tragedy. The mask is not a disguise, but a means of inner transformation. Let's take a look at the moon. The moon in Yeats' system symbolizes human personality and historical phases. Its 28 lunar phases correspond to types of individuals and epochs. Phase 1, the new moon, and phase 15, the full moon, are states of spiritual perfection, unreachable by ordinary humans, but embodied in poetic symbols. The waxing and waning of the moon reflects the opposition between the primary, which is objective or utilitarian, and the antithetical, subjective and artistic, tinctures. The antithetical mask, Yeats believed, is created by passion to lead us back to ourselves through division, unity achieved via contrast. As profound as these are, Yeats' vision expands even further with the introduction of his most dynamic and haunting symbol, the gyre. We're going to take a deeper look at the gyre. So, the third and most expansive of Yeats' symbols is the gyre. It is derived from the automatic writing he conducted with George. The gyre is a whirling cone or spiral, like a spool of thread or the flight of a falcon. For Yeats, it became the symbol of historical motion and psychological opposition. In this model, two interpenetrating gyres rotate in opposite directions, one subjective, the other objective. Every era is shaped by the rise and fall of these forces. For example, at the time of Christ, objectivity reached its maximum. Civilization was shaped by ethical codes, external order, and dogma. The Renaissance, by contrast, marked the high point of subjectivity, of individualism and imagination. Today, Yeats believed we are once again in the end of an age. Our democratic, scientific, data-obsessed civilization belongs to an outward sweeping gyre. But it prepares not for its own continuation, but for a sudden revelation, a lightning flash that will announce a new era. This next phase, Yeats predicted, would restore aristocratic ideals, reviving the age of prince and vizier. At the center of the 2000-year cycles stand Byzantium. For Yeats, a symbolic city of artistic perfection and spiritual balance. This is a civilization that embodies the unity of being expressed in his later poems such as Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium. Even his most personal and visual memories like seeing a Pern Mill in Sligo or the Falcon's Gyre in the Second Coming echo this spiraling vision. His tower, the winding stair, the dancer's silk ribbons, the veiled sword, all of them become manifestations of the gyre. The very structure of time, identity, and transformation for Yeats is spiraled. Now that we have explored the full structure of Yeats' symbolic universe, we are ready to examine how it manifests in his early poetry and how personal loss, artistic ambition, and historical anxiety converge in his lyrical works like Adam's Curse and No Second Troy. But before we do that, let's take a brief look at Yeats' poetic journey. So his journey began between 1889 and 1910, and it falls into two stylistic phases. One that's marked by symbolic, lyrical beauty, and the other by a gradual movement towards spiritual intensity and formal precision. His early poetry often embodies an escapist impulse as he fled the industrial bustle of London for the imagined landscape of Sligo, steeped in Celtic myth and natural beauty. Works like The Wanderings of Oisin, Crossways, The Rose, and The Wind Among the Reeds showcases a poet drawing deeply from Spenser, Shelley, Morris, and the pre-Raphaelite aesthetic. While these works lack the sinewy strength of his later poems, they are far from derivative. They show a lyrical and symbolic unity that earned Yeats his early reputation as a master of musical verse. His symbolist tendencies, influenced by Blake and the French school, were counterbalanced by a love of simple, passionate speech, sharpened especially by his exposure to peasant dialects. Summers spent at Lady Gregory School Park collecting Irish folktales and evenings transcribing them in dialect gave Yeats access to living Irish idiom, later perfected by Synge. But this early mysticism and melody were not enough for Yeats. As he matured, a more philosophical, inward-facing phase began, one defined by disciplined tragic awareness and artistic authority. So, in this movement, beyond the lush aesthetics of the 1890s, Yeats was deeply influenced by what he called the tragic generation. That is, the poets like Lionel Johnson, Ernest Dowson, and George Russell. Though they shared a hatred for dry intellectualized verse and love for melody and mystery, Yeats surpassed them in vision. He embraced painstaking craftsmanship, always returning to revise and refine his lines. But Yeats did not rest within the self-enclosed beauty of art for art's sake. He went further, constructing a mythic vision of Ireland, tragic and heroic as imagined by poets rather than politicians. The Celtic hero, initially a romantic mask, evolved into a figure of spiritual autonomy and moral authority. In his later work, Yeats confronts age, death, and chaos, even as his real-life Norman Tower stood threatened by Civil War violence, a symbol of the poet's mind besieged by history. As early as 1888, in a letter to Catherine Tynan, Yeats reflected that his poems were almost all a flight into fairyland from the real world, a poetry of longing and complaint, the cry of the heart against necessity. But he added that he hoped one day to write poetry not of complaint, but of insight and knowledge. This aspiration would begin to take form after 1910. But its seeds were already planted in this early lyrical phase. Let us now turn into the two pivotal poems, Adam's Curse and No Second Troy, that mark the turning point in Yeats' career, where love, politics, and artistic ambition intersect with growing philosophical depth. Adam's Curse was written in 1902 and sits at the emotional and stylistic crossroads of Yeats' early and mature poetry. Though composed before Maud Gonne's marriage, the poem already registers the pain of love unfulfilled. Set as a conversation poem involving Maud, her sister Mrs. Kathleen Pilcher, and Yeats himself, it suggests intimacy, but only at the surface. Maud's silence creates an emotional distance that undermines the romantic frame. The poem begins with an autumnal mood, suggestive of seasonal decline and inner depletion. The title itself is symbolic, invoking the biblical curse of Adam. In a post-Eden world, everything valuable, poetry, love, even feminine beauty, demands labor. This idea allows Yeats to explore his signature dialectic between the organic spontaneity of love or beauty and the artificial construction of those same experiences in art. The hollow moon, often lush and romantic in earlier verse, now appears empty and cold, a powerful image of emotional disillusionment. Yeats adopts the mask of the courtly lover, but what unfolds is not theatrical devotion, but quiet yearning gently ironized. From the ache of failed intimacy, the poem turns to a broader theme, the making of poetry itself, and how art, like love, requires sustained, invisible effort. The second movement in Adam's Curse shifts from personal yearning to artistic theory. Poetry, Yeats argues, is not effortless inspiration, but arduous construction. What appears spontaneous, a line of verse, a beautiful face, is, in fact, the product of unseen labor. This paradox reflects the Renaissance ideal of sprezzatura, as defined by Castiglione, the art of performing great effort with the appearance of ease. Yeats, who revised obsessively, exposes the falsity of spontaneity. Beauty, whether poetic or feminine, becomes an artificial refashioning of experience. The poem's use of domestic imagery, stitching and unstitching, evokes both craft and ritual. These metaphors connect the poet's labor to that of women. Mrs. Pilcher, with her soft voice and traditional beauty, represents a nurturing femininity grounded in custom and ceremony. Through this, Yeats prepares the ground for his later Byzantium poems, where art and craft, aesthetic form, and spiritual essence become one. Feminine beauty here is not mere ornament. It becomes a mirror, a form of masking through which spontaneity is attained via discipline. But alongside this reverence for artistry, Yeats grows increasingly critical of modernity, of a bourgeois world that devalues the poetic and of idealizations that can no longer survive contact with the real. In fact, in the second stanza, he launches a subtle but biting critique of the bourgeois world. Bankers, teachers, and clergy, the pillars of middle class utilitarianism. They are portrayed as spiritually barren, hostile to artistic creation. For them, poetry is idle, impractical, luxury with no place in an industrial, progress-driven society. But for Yeats, true poetry is not leisure, it's internal warfare. He describes it in autobiographies as the act of those who spin a web out of their own bowels, a visceral, sacrificial process of transforming pain into form. Here, he approaches unity of being not through doctrine but through lived contradiction. In the fourth stanza, the poem loops back to the ideal of courtly love, only to undermine it. The sighing lover, styled after antique books, now appears self-parodic. The lover's mask is no longer vital. It has become a literary costume worn out by the realities of modern world. What once inspired poetry now feels like an idle trade. The moon, a recurring symbol, shifts again. It becomes not only hollow, but shriveling, drained, an emblem of emotional fatigue. With this, the poem offers a quiet wake-up moment. Not bitter resignation, but a clear-sighted recognition. Yeats moves from ornamented sorrow to philosophical acceptance and a poetry capable of holding both. Let's now jump into No Second Troy. This poem marks Yeats' stylistic and thematic transformation. Appearing in The Green Helmet and Other Poems in 1910, this piece moves decisively away from the mystical symbolism into the realm of public rhetoric, satiric anger, and poetic control of disillusionment. The style becomes leaner, more realistic, and Maud Gonne, his longtime muse, is no longer a dreamy idol. She becomes a real person and also a mythic figure. Yeats casts her as Helen of Troy, whose abduction by Paris sparked a war and ended in the destruction of Troy. The comparison is deliberate. Maud married John McBride, a nationalist executed after the 1916 uprising. The Yeats-Gonne-McBride triangle within the context of Irish nationalism reflects the passion, betrayal, and destruction of the Trojan War. When Gonne appeared at the Abbey Theatre in 1906, the audience hissed her. It was a moment that exposed the sectarian, moralistic fury of the Irish lower middle class, a group Yeats viewed with increasing disdain. As he wrote in autobiographies, their politics were rooted in hatred, not vision. This poem reflects that growing alienation. But Yeats doesn't merely condemn the political culture. Through No Second Troy, he elevates his personal anguish into the realm of myth and tragic beauty. Also in No Second Troy, he places personal sorrow within the turbulence of Irish history. Maud Gonne is obviously both muse and militant. She taught to ignorant men most violent ways, encouraging insurrection among a population Yeats saw as culturally unready. While Yeats remained aloof from political extremism, Maud demanded that he use poetry as propaganda. She even introduced him to Arthur Griffith, founder of Sinn Féin, hoping to align the literary and political movements. At one point, she proposed plans for bombing British troop ships, a militant passion Yeats could neither share nor entirely condemn. In his diary, Yeats confessed that Gonne never understood my ideas. But he also admitted that her failure to understand him was strangely liberating. As he put it, if she understood, I should lack a reason for writing. His writing thus became an act of self-explanation, an aesthetic transformation of miscommunication and longing. The poem avoids bitterness through controlled myth-making, where Maud's rage and beauty assume the grandeur of tragic destiny. The poem's true power lies in its closing vision, where Maud becomes fire, both divine and destructive, embodying a purity that stands outside time. Her beauty and intensity are not personal traits and become poetic symbols of fiery grandeur. In No Second Troy, Yeats presents her as an antithesis to the modern fractured consciousness. She is fire, pure, elemental, destructive. Her beauty, described as like a Titan bow, conveys not just elegance, but tension, danger, and sexual energy. Yeats once wrote that she seemed to belong to an ancient civilization. her face that of a Greek statue. In this poem, he elevates her to mythic tragic dimensions, setting her apart from the petty politics of her time. The poem is structured as four rhetorical questions, each a layer in Yeats' internal interrogation of Maud, of his own suffering, and of Ireland's destiny. In doing so, he transforms disappointment into artistic clarity and myth into commentary on modern chaos. Maud's tragic innocence, her noble intentions, and destructive results prefigures Yeats' later poems like Leda and the Swan and The Second Coming, where violence and rebirth emerge together. With No Second Troy, Yeats shows how a personal grievance filtered through art and myth can become a vision of history, politics, and desire itself, forged in fire, formed in verse. That brings us to the end of W.B. Yeats' poetic summary and a historical and cultural background, and of course a sum of Adam's Curse and No Second Troy. Let's quickly sum up what we've explored. W.B. Yeats' poetry reflects a powerful journey from romantic escapism and Irish folklore to his political conflict, emotional realism, and finally philosophical vision. His Anglo-Irish identity, his deep fascination with myth and magic, and his lifelong passion for Maud Gonne all feed into his major poetic concerns: the division of self, the nature of beauty, the burden of history, and the labor of art. We saw how Yeats constructs a personal symbolic system of Mars, moon, and gyres to explain both historical cycles and human psychology. In Adam's Curse, he exposes poetry as hard-won labor. In No Second Troy, personal grief is transformed into tragic myth. For your exam, focus on how Yeats' style changed over time, how his personal and national experiences are reflected in his work, and how myth is never separate from history or emotion. In Yeats' world, conflict leads to insight, and poetry is never ornamental, it is essential. And we are at the end of today's video. Please share your thoughts and questions in the comments section, and if you did find this session helpful, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Your Learn Lab. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Until then, happy learning.